My name is Sheena Patel, and today we will be discussing the asbestos tragedy in Libby, Montana. Today we will be talking about what exactly happened in Libby, Montana, and how did the public come to find out about the dangerous asbestos and why it took so long for any relief efforts to be made. We will also explore how the community was impacted and what are the latest ongoing efforts to help make the area clean once again. The three main highlights we will be looking at is where and how the vermiculite spread throughout Libby, how have residents been impacted over the years with their health and environment, and finally, how has the EPA implemented their own cleanup efforts to help with preventative measures. Let's take a look at the small town of Libby, Montana, that has approximately 2,000 residents. The mining industry was a great source of income for the area. Therefore, when vermiculite was found, it was like they struck gold, and mining began in 1919. Let's fast forward to almost 30 years later, and a company, W.R. Grace and Company, took over control of the mining site. Allegedly at the time, W.R. Grace took over the mining contract, and they were aware of the asbestos exposure in the area. Although they did nothing about it, they failed to inform the public about what preventative measures could be taken by residents, or they could have alternatively found other areas to locate the vermiculite at and change to a different mine site. It was only 20 years ago, in 1999, that the EPA began to start cleanup efforts. And that is where our story unfolds. What is vermiculite, you may ask? It is a naturally occurring mineral that is used for insulation during construction for homes and buildings. Normally, vermiculite is safe, but specifically at the Libby, Montana site, quote, it had close proximity to asbestos deposits, which may have been used for attic insulation in homes during the 1900s. Vermiculite has been mined in other parts of the United States, but the exposure to the deposits were nowhere near what they were in Libby, Montana. So let's take a look about one of the first things to look at is how vermiculite was prevalent for respiratory symptoms in those adults that were children at the time of when exposure happened. Approximately 11% over the years ended up developing a cough. 14% had shortness of breath, and 6% coughed up bloody phlegm. Through all the respiratory systems, what other damages can occur? Asbestos causes a disease called mesothelioma. This occurs when one inhales the asbestos fibers and, as a result, damage their DNA and cause inflammation and scarring. The disease of the mesothelioma develops obviously after prolonged exposures of asbestos dust. As a result, some of the fibers can get caught in the lungs or the abdominal tract, eventually leading to cancer. Several exposures could occur. It could be a direct exposure, such as those meaning the miners that were at the sites, secondary exposure, which means family members of the miners at the sites, and a third exposure, which is considered environmental. These are the residents of Libby, Montana that were exposed even if they knew no one at the mining site. This study showed a case of 6 males and 5 females aging from the range of mid-40s to late 80s and had an exposure year as short as 2 years all the way up to 67 years, meaning their whole life. The sources of these exposures came from either primary, which is they were actual miners at the site, secondary, which is where they got exposure from their family because they knew loved ones that worked at the site, or thirdly, they were simply just living in the town of Libby, Montana. So now we want to talk about what about the mortality of asbestos? Is there any way that people have actually succumbed to this disease? And unfortunately, the reality is that yes, they have. Approximately 27.73% of cases of those who had passed away from asbestos exposure were due to diseases of the respiratory system. On average, a lot of these people ended up developing malignant melanomas in various parts of their organs in the body, which showed that asbestos exposure was somehow trapped inside of their body. So the next thing we're going to look at is what about now the EPA efforts? Who is going to help the town of Libby, Montana return to its natural state in years from when it was first unexposed by the EPA? Libby, Montana has a Superfund site set up. It's called the Superfund site for Libby, Montana. And there are several places where the EPA has started cleanup efforts for the town of Libby, Montana. Some of the notable sites of cleanup are Operable Unit 1, which where the former export plant was located in the heart of Libby. Operable Unit 3 was the former vermiculite mine, most likely where the most direct exposure could have come from. Operable Unit 2 was the former screening plant, exactly where things were located for those miners that were screening for asbestos. And another couple of notable sites is the Operable Unit 7, which is the residential, commercial, and public property around Troy, which is about 20 miles west of Libby. That just goes to show how far the vermiculite traveled and how far the asbestos exposure came for those residents that weren't even in the town of Libby. So what happened to the company that started this all? W.R. Grace and Company clearly had to pay for the damages that they inflicted upon many families for years and years of tragic deaths or respiratory symptoms that they occurred into their adulthood. The financial fallout for W.R. Grace was quite hefty. After many court disputes, the courts settled that W.R. Grace and Company owed $250 million in 2008 to help with EPA cleanup efforts. 8 years later, the number jumped up to almost $540 million. And it is predicted by 2020, $604 million would have been used by the EPA in order to clean up these different varied sites at Libby, Montana. So in summary, let's talk about things that we discussed today. Vermiculite contaminated with asbestos affected the lives of those living in Libby, Montana to this day. Many residents suffered from health conditions into their adulthood or succumbed to the disease related to asbestos. EPA efforts to clean up the sites have improved the lives of locals over the years. In fact, Operable Unit 2, as of April 2019, has been removed from the EPA Superfund list. W.R. Grace and Company made a poor decision that could have been prevented a long time ago, and as a result, they are now currently carrying a very heavy financial burden on their shoulders. And these are my sources. Thank you for listening.